It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's April 25th, 1977, and this is Dialogue Conspiracy number 266. The famous Bilderbergers, or the infamous Bilderbergers, were meeting this past weekend, the weekend of April 23rd, 24th, and 25th in Paris, outside of Paris. And this organization has been described not enough by the John Birch Society, by the National Labor Caucus, and by a few investigators who are trying to find out who is really controlling the world, the free or the unfree world, whichever way you see it. This group is represented by Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, Mr. Giovanni, the Fiat Corporation, heads of foundations, industrialists, bankers, economists, think tank experts, professors, journalists. It's a secret group that have been meeting since 1954. They started at the time of the Cold War days between 1952 and 53, headed by a Dr. Joseph Rettinger, R-E-T-I-N-G-E-R, a Pole, a white Russian, who decided that the heads of state after World War II should get together and decide their future and decide what is good for us. These people are powerful politicians, and they do influence the White House. They influence the selection of our presidents and vice presidents. Mr. Mondale and Jimmy Carter were both at the Bilderberger meetings before they were suggested as nominees and handpicked by David Rockefeller to become the president and vice president of the United States in 1976. The meetings are top secret. We don't get access to the minutes of the meetings. And right now they're having a conference on what to do with the third world. This description was in the Los Angeles Times and the Monterey Herald. I didn't pick it up in any other newspapers this week about the meetings, but according to Don Cook for the Los Angeles Times, he said that these participants are there figuring out what to do with the third world's demand for restructuring the world order and its political implications. He went on to note that members of the meeting are not black. There are no blacks. There are no browns. There are no yellows in the color scheme of the meetings, and there's no reds either. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was one of the early founders of the Bilderberger, and it lists a few people that will attend, a few corporations that help fund it: Fiat, Ford, Unilever, Courtwalds, Imperial Chemicals, Kleinwort, Benson, Alcan, Lehman Brothers, Dunlap Rubber, Exxon, August Thyssen-Ute, Tube Investment, Shell, General Electric. Those are a few of the corporations. And William P. Bundy, editor of Foreign Affairs Quarterly, is part of the American Steering Committee of the Bilderbergers. I think it's interesting that the time that the Bilderbergers is meeting, that Ethiopia suddenly shut their doors to the American government and told us to be out of there, to have our bases out of there within 5 days. And they also have ordered France and Belgium and Britain and the Sudan to get out of Ethiopia. They said that the United States military had to pull out of their military assistance and advisory group, their Navy medical research group, to close down the Kagnu Communications Center, shut the American Cultural Center and the small library centers in Ethiopia. Ethiopia claims that even tourists are disguised as CIA agents. The 2 black Americans arrested March 23rd in northwest Ethiopia entered the country on tourist visas and actually were agents of the CIA. They've asked France and West Germany, Italy and Britain, all members of the Bilderberger Conference that have cultural centers in Ethiopia, to get out. And this came just at this weekend as they were meeting in Europe. They said there's a clash with the U.S. Cultural Center, and they don't want their scientific research going on, and they are no more use to Ethiopia. I think this is important. There are not that many Americans stationed there, but we do have military personnel, cultural officers, State Department officials, Navy officers, Marine Guards, civilians under the guise of doctors, Navy research, and communication centers in Ethiopia. I'm just wondering if you ever take a map and look at the globe of the world and mark it off and color in sometime the military dictatorships that the United States has put into power since 1964. Take a real hard look at that since the year after John Kennedy was killed, and ask yourself what is going on now and how many people are going to respond like Ethiopia, how many countries are going to be aware that the white Anglo-Saxon is running the world, using up the world's resources, instigating slavery, dispensing weapons around the world to turn people against each other. On Dialogue Conspiracy, I talk each week about individual assassinations or conspiracies, but I also talk about planned genocide and genetic research and weather control. But I wonder how much resistance we are going to get, we, meaning the United States, to the hanky-panky that we've spread around the world. And when are we going to feel it at home? And when we feel it at home, will we stop being so sure of ourselves? When I came into KLRB today, there was an article, a news announcement from Zodiac News Service, which I didn't get in my 10 papers a day. It was dated April 15th. And I thought I would just read this with you in case you didn't hear it on the news, because it goes along with the kind of attitude meeting at the Bilderbergers this past weekend. It's an article that the director of a Stockholm International Peace Research Institute came out with a report on the amount of weapons that are being sold and traded by the major industrialized countries of the world. This was published in Britain, called New Scientific Magazine, by Dr. Frank Barnaby, and these are some of the statistics since World War II. Barnaby writes that between 1945 and 1976, there have been at least 133 wars. There's an average of 12 conflicts in progress on any given day. Almost every one of these wars is taking place in the Third World. The bulk of the weapons are supplied by the industrialized nations, those countries that are attending the Bilderberger secret meetings every year. The peace researchers said that participation in the arms race is worldwide. Weapons are supplied to 95 countries that import major weapons just in this past 1976. Weapons include ships, tanks, missiles, and aircraft, and go out to approximately, it says 105 countries. 75 of these countries are Third World. This is imported military equipment. He also concluded his study by saying that since the end of World War II, there have been tens of millions of casualties, and there is no end in sight to this appalling record of violence. Now, this is still far removed from America, the United States, but it can't stay that far off if the Arab nations and the Chinese and the South Americans, the Latin Americans, the Africans, decide that the white Anglo-Saxon is not only providing the weapons, but starving these people and turning them against each other. They may instantly close their bases and say, go home to America. And I think the youth of today, the college students, the high school students, have to face the reality that we have done a lot of damage, particularly since World War II, and certainly much earlier, after World War I, rebuilding Germany and causing World War II. The industrialists from the United States, along with Britain and France and the white Russian community that left Russia when the Tsar was removed from his power. I think the young generation today have to face the fact that they're going to inherit this mess, and they have to face it. And it's going to be a possibility that wherever they travel or go, the borders will be closed, and Americans will not be welcomed, and the agents will be removed, and the resistance of the people can be just as strong as North Vietnam's resistance was to the American troops and might, and the people may have more power than the accumulation of the weapons. They may stop shooting each other and arming against each other and unite and realize that the common enemy, the common denominator, is us. And that is the reality you're going to have to face, just like the children of Germany had to face. The common enemy was their own German government that went into Poland and Yugoslavia and Romania and Hungary and France and Belgium and Italy and South Africa. The enemy was right in their government, and the bombs that fell on them were something that some claimed that caught by surprise, and they didn't know about extermination camps. But most of them had an opportunity to learn and know ahead of time, and they had to pay the consequences of this ignorance, or the playing ignorance. And I think this is something the American people are going to have to face too. There's an article to another subject in Mother Jones. It's a magazine that isn't readily available, but maybe you can get it on your newsstands or write for it. It's not available on the Monterey Peninsula. I don't see it in the magazine stores, but we don't have too many here anyway. But it was sent to me. It's an article by Roger Rappaport, the April 77 Mother Jones, and it's about a man, a black agent that worked for the FBI until he decided to expose them. And his name is Dothard Perry. And Dothard Perry, it's an article about what he did for the Los Angeles Police Department as a counterintelligence agent after he left the Vietnamese Army, and he worked in Army intelligence in Vietnam. Dothard Perry is the counterpart to Louis Tackwood, who worked for the Los Angeles Police Department at the same time. Tackwood worked with Ron Karenga and Donald DeFries and Melvin Cotton Smith, agents of the Los Angeles Police Department who were involved in killing Black Panthers, in setting up murders, sending innocent men to prison on death row on testimony that was falsified. Tackwood came clean in his book, The Glass House Tapes, and told of some of these experiences. But the counterpart to the police department doing this in the Los Angeles area was the FBI, and Mr. Perry was the agent that was selected. He called me about 3 weeks ago, and he told me that he was coming down to see me, and he'd bring me documents because his life was in danger, and he wanted me to have them, and he wanted to bring proof that the FBI has been behind terrorism, counterintelligence, setting up arrests in the Los Angeles area, and he was afraid that his life would be in danger. I haven't heard from Mr. Perry. I don't know if he's alive or dead now, but it's similar to George de Mohrenschildt missing for several weeks and then being found dead in Florida. He was a major witness in the Kennedy assassination. I thought I should tell you about Dothard Perry, and we'll keep alert and hope that he does appear here sometime before too long and that he's safe. As I say, he worked in military intelligence in Vietnam and was released in 1968 and was attending Sacramento State and was approached by the FBI when he came home from the war to infiltrate the left. His code names were Othello and Ed Riggs. Those were his aliases, and he worked for the FBI. He's a black man. He was hired to sabotage the Black Panther program and also set fire to various agencies in Los Angeles, destroy records, infiltrate radio station KPFA. He took control of video programs and communications in the area at the Watts Center that was built there after the fire for the black people. There's a new office built, a new center that Sammy Davis had donated a piano, and he was responsible for this building catching fire and being completely burned. He got his firearms from the FBI that he gave to radicals and planted with them, and then they were arrested. He planted radical literature in the offices to link them to guerrilla movement. He bugged the offices. He photographed people in the Los Angeles community and turned them over to the FBI. He destroyed 10 years of tapes from the Watts summer festivals and the writer's workshop that he carefully infiltrated. He'd interview people like Bobby Seale and have a camera on him and take his speeches and film him and then send it directly to the FBI. He slept with radical women activists, and he turned over information on their sex habits. He was assigned to various women in the area, and 9 of them, he said, he had slept with, and turned to the FBI the information about these particular people. On January the 15th, 1973, he burned personal papers and documents of Angela Davis and literature belonging to the black organizations. The FBI insisted that the arson that he did always make it appear that the underground guerrilla warfare was going on and that the fires were caused by the underground and not be linked to the FBI. He destroyed information on a fundraising dinner, April 1973. 1,000 invitations were sent out for a black organization to have fundraising. Nobody showed up. The mail was lost. He destroyed it. The postage, the printing was wasted. The food money was expended, and nobody showed up for the dinner. He made 15,000 names disappear from fundraising lists in the black area in Los Angeles. He managed to take over the black workshop, as I say, in Watts, and set fire to it, burn it in ashes. And the FBI, he said, was delighted at the destruction of the West's biggest black cultural center that was built in Watts. The FBI gave him ID and money and the name of a sporting goods store where he was allowed to go in and buy firearms, and then he planted incendiary devices and guerrilla warfare handbooks in a black library, and the FBI was tipped off on the raid. And one of the persons who was hurt by this was a man named Neil Nelson, who was the director of a freedom school in Los Angeles that was doing nothing but better black conditions, and he had founded this school. And Nelson was convicted of firearms charges in May of 1975. He infiltrated KPFK, Pacifica radio station for the FBI, which reminds me now that their Pacifica station, sister station in New York City, the controversial WBAI, is now going off the air this week permanently. It was the stronghold of the left, the anti-war movement. It was the station that played all the Watergate hearings hour after hour. It was a station that played the complete conspiracy conference of researchers in Boston in 1975, and they played Dialogue Conspiracy for weeks until finally, I believe it was when the Hughes case came to a head and the links of Dialogue Conspiracy to Howard Hughes. I believe that was the bottom line of exposure on New York radio. I was going to New York, meeting too many people there, speaking at the Elgin Theater several times, growing a completely new audience in New York, a big audience. As Mark Lane said on BAI shortly before both of us were not allowed on the air anymore in that station, he got on the air and said, "This is Mae Brussell country," and felt defensive there because I had attacked Mark Lane on various areas of his research, and he got on by saying this is Mae Brussell country. Well, New York is cut off now. WBAI is no longer going to be able to function as an FM radio station, and KPFK in Los Angeles was infiltrated by Mr. Perry. He also got an assignment, Dr. Perry, to take weapons from the National Guard Armory. He took 95 M16 rifles and 7 M60s under the direction of the FBI, and at the time of these burglaries, the press carried the story that radical terrorists had taken these weapons. And he promised me that when he does come to Carmel, and if he's alive, he has the serial number of these M16s, and he's going to bring me one of these M16s, which I will then deliver to the FBI office in Monterey and explain to them that this was taken by an agent of the FBI and not by any radical terrorist, and ask them to retract in the newspaper the stories that the terrorists were raiding and are raiding the armories. The IDs are handed out by the FBI, and the weapons are handed out by the FBI. Another piece of suppressed news that I wanted to mention to you because I'm not hearing very much about it is coming out of Salt Lake City. There's a gentleman there, Dr. John W. Fitzgerald, who has worked with various researchers on the Mormon Watergate links. He's been invaluable to researchers, and he had a house guest at his home. This was the weekend of April the 6th. Douglas A. Wallace was the house guest at his home. He had flown in from Vancouver, Washington, and it was the weekend of the large worldwide conference of the Mormons in Salt Lake City. What happened was that a police car, plainclothes policeman, pulled up in front of the home of Mr. Fitzgerald, about 100 feet away from the house, the bedroom, and pulled up in a plain car, and Mr. Wallace seemed to be under surveillance, as was Mr. Fitzgerald. And another policeman pulled up and was in a plain car and saw the plainclothesman and didn't know that both men were under surveillance, and one policeman shot the other policeman and paralyzed him, shot him in the neck. And it was right outside of the home of Dr. John W. Fitzgerald and the home where Mr. Wallace, the controversial Mormon who wants blacks in the Mormon church as priests, was staying. There was a lot of scandal in Salt Lake City that was quickly hushed up in the Salt Lake papers, and a demand for an explanation of why these men were under surveillance. Watergate is supposed to be over, or so we're told, and yet the FBI and the local police department are still into surveillance of innocent citizens. This wounding of an undercover police officer was done under the surveillance of these gentlemen that shouldn't have happened in the first place. And a suit has been filed by Mr. Wallace in the court, saying that the Latter-day Saints, the church at Salt Lake City, the Mormon church, conspired to deprive him of his civil rights. And they've asked the FBI and the local authorities why the surveillance of the house early in the morning, who was operating the surveillance, why were the city vice officers in the county without the knowledge of the county sheriff? Who was the secret informant involved that said where Mr. Walls was staying? Why is the acting chief Bryan denying the surveillance when it's common knowledge that the police and sheriff department were surveying this home? They're denying the surveillance in spite of the fact that these men shot each other outside the home. Why were the vice officers driving their own vehicles rather than police vehicles? And why were they shooting each other? Obviously, they probably thought that one of those men was living in the house and was either Mr. Walls or Mr. Fitzgerald and shot, not knowing that they were shooting another plainclothes officer. This started out to be April 6th and 7th, another Watergate in Salt Lake City. It's been hushed up even in the Salt Lake Tribune. There's nothing about the suit on this matter or the investigation or the explanations of the shootout or the surveillance, but both of these people have been controversial, and both of them have made the news. Well, Dr. Fitzgerald hasn't made the news in terms of research, but he's been very important to supply researchers. And, of course, none of us feel comfortable when our sources of information are almost shot at, or there's a shooting outside their window, or they're under surveillance. This is one good way of silencing people like myself who are exposing these crimes, is by getting at the people who are the source of information. Incidentally, Mr. Phillips of the CIA, who was the CIA officer in Mexico City at the time Lee Harvey Oswald was there, he's come out with a book defending the CIA. He's a lecturer of the CIA, was in New York City last night on WMCA with CIA radio announcer Candy Jones. And Mr. Phillips was talking about various persons who are trying to link the intelligence community to the news media, and he talked about Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. So they do take note of what's going on out here, and I hope they leave some of these witnesses or suppliers of information alive, but the picture is pretty dismal. In addition to shooting outside the home of where Mr. Walls and Mr. Fitzpatrick lives, there's another witness to a conspiracy trial who was murdered April the 15th, and this comes from Billings, Montana, and it goes along the line of murdering the witnesses that I've been talking about so much lately. There's a very fine researcher named Lake Headley III. Lake Headley lives in Billings, Montana, and he did fantastic research into the Indian affairs. He helped a Wounded Knee trial, and he also helped with the SLA story. He was right on the spot at the time of the shootout, picking up the bullets, getting the police reports, photographing, getting the photographs of the police dogs, the Patty Hearst dogs that sniffed the cottage and went away and knew that Patty wasn't inside when they set fire to the cottage, and collected all kinds of information for Willie Wolf's father, one of the gentlemen that was burned in the shootout. And Lake Headley moved to Montana and was arrested on a charge of growing marijuana, a very serious charge in Montana, along with his co-workers. And these arrest warrants could be very mean, and he's been fighting this for a while. And there was a deputy there, Charles Adcock, who wanted to come to his aid. He was a deputy sheriff who claimed that he would be killed. He said this on Wednesday, April 14th, that he would be killed when he testified against the police department. He was going to charge that evidence was planted against Lake Headley and Elizabeth Schmidt, as I say, two fine investigators into the political conspiracies in the United States. And he wanted, this particular sheriff wanted to tell how this evidence was planted and testify at this trial. He was a key witness. It's called the Red Lodge drug case. You'd think this was a $1 billion heroin connection. It's a little bit of marijuana that was supposed to have been grown by Lake Headley and the defendants. And this trial was coming up. And Charles Adcock, the key witness, said in Billings, Montana, April the 14th, 1977, "If I told you everything I know about this case, I'd be dead tomorrow." And Thursday, the next day, he was dead. Deputy Sheriff Charles Adcock, 51, died of unknown causes. His body was embalmed. It was ordered to be embalmed almost immediately by unidentified law enforcement officials. Midway through the embalming process, Judge Robert Wilson of Billings ordered the body sent to Great Falls for an autopsy, even though most of the vital fluids were missing at that time. Deputy Adcock, who was deeply involved in the investigation of the Red Lodge case, gave testimony in court Wednesday, that's April 14th, 1977, which implied that the lawman may have planted drugs in the home of defendant Donald Wogeman last September. Wogeman, his son Timothy, Lake Healy III, and Elizabeth Schmidt are accused of cultivating marijuana in Red Lodge last summer. And this is an important witness to a case who not only said he would be killed, but was murdered the next day, and the autopsy was ordered immediately. The widow of this gentleman said that his death will not kill his story, but that's only in the Billings Gazette, Billings, Montana, if you want to send for it, April 15th, 1977. These are single tragedies that add up to a general large loss of life, and I am keeping track of these tragedies. The committee in Washington, D.C. that's investigating the Kennedy assassination has lost another vital witness this week. We're told he was on in years. This is Dr. Halpern, who died, but Dr. Milton Halpern. But I don't believe any longer that because he was 75 years of age, he necessarily died from natural deaths. He might have, but he might not have. And his testimony is very important to the investigations going on in Washington, D.C. He had been ill for quite a while, but when you read the details of Groucho Marx case, you realize that even old men don't necessarily die of senility, and sometimes they get a little help even after being sick for quite a while. Just this last Thursday, the 21st, 1977, April 21st, Dr. Robert Shaw, one of the surgeons on John Connally, who was governor of Texas at the time that John Kennedy was killed, he had a press conference in Texas, the Dallas Morning News, in which he stated that he believed that John Connally was not hit by the same bullet that struck John Kennedy. Now, this information was supplied to me by Ted Gandolfo, who lives in New York City and got a hold of the Dallas Morning News. It was also in the Zodiac Press. Nothing of Dr. Shaw's testimony of I keep calling it testimony of his press conference of the 21st was in the Associated Press, United Press, or any newspapers that we get out here in Carmel. I haven't seen his press conference at all covered by the major media. And I brought some of his testimony before the Warren Commission, in which Dr. Shaw said in 1964 that he didn't believe that pristine bullet 399 that had gone through John Kennedy had caused all the wounds in John Connally. That testimony would indicate, of course, then that more than one gunman had to be used at the time of the Kennedy assassination. I don't believe Oswald fired any of the shots, but it means that one plus Oswald, even if you went on the assumption Oswald had shot a gun that day, there was another gunman, and therefore a conspiracy. But April the 21st, Dr. Shaw did have the press conference, and he said that the bullet fragments in John Connally's body were of such a substance that you couldn't have a pristine bullet and still have that many fragments come out of it into the body of John Connally, and that he didn't believe that there was this single bullet theory that did all the damage. That press conference was Thursday, the 21st of April, 1977, and then the man with the most expertise on this particular case, Dr. Milton Halpern, died April the 22nd, 1977. Dr. Halpern is a famed pathologist, the most famous in the world. He's done 40 years of work. He's retired from the medical examiner's office in New York City, and he died Friday, the day after Dr. Shaw's press conference, at the age of 75. He had been in San Diego to give a lecture where he had a stroke. He was described in the Associated Press story from the Monterey Herald here as having an antagonistic relationship with F. Lee Bailey, who's represented CIA clients many times. He said that he testified for a trial of Dr. Carl Coppolini in New Jersey, an anesthesiologist, and against F. Lee Bailey, who represented the client. And the doctor was acquitted of murder charges, and then later a second jury convicted Bailey's client of murdering his wife, and Dr. Halpern had clashed with F. Lee Bailey a few years ago on this particular matter. Dr. Halpern wrote a book. It's an important book. It's called Where Death delights. And he tells about his experience with gun wounds. It came out in 1967. And he talks about the assassination of John Kennedy. And because he died this week, I thought I should read you a little bit from his book and some of Dr. Shaw's testimony and also Dr. Gregory's to show you that in 1964 and in 1967, these gentlemen were saying that one single bullet could not have gone through John Kennedy, his back, and exited his Adam's apple and gone through John Connally's back and come out of his chest and into his arm and out the wrist and into his leg and been pristine, found on a stretcher and never really identified which stretcher at Parkland Hospital. All of this sounds comical to say it. I heard this repeated on Merv Griffin's show, and when the various people were talking about Mort Saul and Shane Alexander, they were laughing at the impossibility of this. And yet the testimony of Dr. Shaw and Dr. Gregory or Dr. Halpern was available since 1964 and 1967, and it isn't comical. And the important thing is it's making the headlines now. And the unfortunate thing is, as it makes the headlines, Dr. Halpern is not around to testify. What he wrote in his book, I'll read you just a few sentences from it in 1967. He said, one continuing theme permeates the entire final work of the Warren Report. It is the demand that the medical evidence be interpreted so as to be consistent with their already well-established theory that all of the bullets involved were fired from a single rifle found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. The tragic thing, Dr. Halpern said, is that a relatively simple case was horribly snarled up from the very beginning, and then the errors were compounded at almost every other step along the way. Here is a historic event that will be discussed and written about for the next century, and gnawing doubts will remain. The errors started at the beginning, he said. First of all, the selection of the hospital pathologist to perform the medico-legal autopsy. It's like sending a 7-year-old boy who's taken 3 lessons on the violin to the New York Philharmonic and expecting him to perform a Tchaikovsky symphony. Colonel Fink's position through the entire proceedings was uncomfortable. He was in the role of a bastard Army child foisted into the Navy family reunion. This is Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, without any experience in bullet wounds. And you have to remember that all of his experience into bullet autopsies was files and pictures and records of finished cases. There's a world of difference between doing an autopsy on the table and administrative work. The major problem in any gunshot case is to determine the wound of entry and the wound of exit, and this is basic. And the Warren Commission was left dangling, he says, with not knowing whether the throat wound was an exit or an entry. The staff members who wrote the portions of the report do not understand medical procedures. They didn't know enough to seek medical guidance. I differ with them there. I think they purposely fouled this up. I think they could have had the guidance if they wanted. The throat in John Kennedy's throat wound in John Kennedy's neck could have been evaluated. They could have put the pieces together and decided if there was an entry or exit bullet. Their lack of experience deprived these men of the knowledge of what should be done. Secondly, from every facet of the evidence available at the time, when they finished their autopsy and closed the body for burial, they labored under the illusion that the hole in the back of the neck was both a wound of entry and a wound of exit. The phraseology in the formal autopsy protocol implies or suggests that the doctors still had doubts or uncertainties at the time it was written. They spoke of the wounds as presumably of entry, presumably of exit, as far as it can be ascertained. And this does not read like a work of men in confident command of their ship. On the other side of the coin, the writers of the Warren Report went to the opposite extreme. They tried to get a unanimous opinion, and they stated too positively. Commander Hume simply did not appreciate that this was not another hospital autopsy. He goes on to say how he burned his autopsy reports. The FBI report at the time of the autopsy was finished. The doctors thought they were dealing with only 3 bullet holes, 2 in the head, 1 in the back of the neck. Where did the Warren Commission, as distinguished from the autopsy surgeons, fail to clarify the issue? It failed tragically because it didn't have sufficient knowledge in the field of forensic medicine to even appreciate the need to call in an expert to do the autopsy of John Kennedy with any experience in bullet wounds. They lack the knowledge, and it is evident in their report. They include all kinds of meaningless pictures in the Warren report of Marina Oswald, of Oswald's mother, Oswald as a young boy, Jack Ruby's associates, and his girlfriends. But the x-rays of President Kennedy's body weren't considered significant enough to the entire investigation to put in as exhibits. Their excuse was that it was in bad taste, and they were considering the good taste of the family. Well, there was nothing that offended the good taste in the 9 x-rays of Governor Connally's body, Warren Commission Exhibit 691, according to Dr. Halpern. So you see, there was a great curtain of secrecy that was pulled down on the x-rays and pictures of the president's body that could only add more explosive fuel to the fire of doubt. This doubt is still shredded by a curtain of secrecy, and secrecy is a natural cultural media for suspicion. Dr. Halpern said, "My first interest would be to see whether there was another bullet or fragment of bullets in the body that could be accounted for." Remember, the Warren Commission concluded the preponderance of evidence indicated 3 shots altogether. Only 1 relatively intact bullet and the fragments of a second were found. I definitely do not agree with the Commission's conclusions that only 2 bullets caused all the wounds suffered by President Kennedy and Governor Connally. Since the x-rays of the President's body were not filed as exhibits, we have to rely on the Navy doctors, he goes on to say, who were unskilled, who were not probing. They have been quoted publicly as saying they had the x-rays available to them that night, and then they went on later and said they did not develop the x-rays. Again, it was a grievous error of admission that they didn't call in someone who knew something about bullet wounds in the body. Dr. Halpern is, as I say, the most expert authority on bullet wounds in the United States. He was the chief medical examiner of New York. He performed and supervised about 60,000 autopsies. 10,000 of them were gunshot wounds in the body, and yet he was not called in for this autopsy or an opinion. He wrote in his book, "It is a grievous error of admission to fail to call in someone." And then he tells about the final trap of buying assistant counsel Arlene Specter's theory that the same bullet which passed through the president's neck was the bullet that also wounded Governor Connally, shattered his 5th rib, fractured a bone in the wrist, went on to slash his thigh, and now this bizarre path when you're working with bullet wounds is impossible. First, you have the original pristine weight when the bullet was fired, and then you have the weight of the bullet recovered on the stretcher in Parkland Hospital that was reported by the Warren Commission of 158.6 grams, and pristine it was 160 grams. This bullet wasn't distorted in any way. I cannot accept the premise that this bullet thrashed around in all that bony tissue and lost only 1.4 to 2.4 grains of its original weight. I cannot believe either that this bullet is going to emerge miraculously, unscathed, without any deformity, with its lands and grooves intact. Mr. Specter and the Warren Commission asked too much from this bullet. This single bullet theory requires us to believe that this bullet went through 7 layers of skin, tough, elastic, resistant skin. I'm reading from Where Death Delights by Dr. Morton Halpern on the autopsy of John Kennedy and the single bullet theory. He said it passed through the back of the president's neck, went out through his throat, entered the governor's back, out through his chest, entered the skin on the back of his wrist, came out through the layer of skin, the inside of the wrist. It apparently penetrated the layer of skin on his left side, on his left thigh, and in addition to 7 layers of tough human skin, it passed through other layers of soft tissue and shattered these bones. And I can't believe this bullet had the force to do what Arlene Specter and the Warren Commission demanded of it. And I don't think they have really stopped to think out carefully what they asked of this bullet. In my opinion, this beautifully preserved bullet that was found in the hospital was the first bullet that was fired. It passed through the president's neck, exited from the throat wound, and was stopped by his clothing or plopped out of his neck into his clothing. And he says the Warren Commission's conclusion on Governor Connally having the bullet on his stretcher is only based on tortured evidence. There is no positive evidence, is inconclusive to say the least, and no one will ever know for sure which stretcher the bullet came from. They asked him, do you agree with Governor Connally that he was struck by the second bullet? And Dr. Halpern said, I definitely do. His testimony is the most persuasive. I just can't buy the theory that this beautifully preserved first bullet is going to have power enough to pass through 7 layers of skin, 2 men, soft tissue, rib, wrist bone, and lost no more than 2.4 grams. Assistant Counsel Arlene Specter's creation of the theory of a single bullet is wrong. He said the FBI reports were wrong on the assassination, and they took this evidence and turned it around and wrote this single bullet theory, which is the most amateurish conclusion of the entire commission report. This is just a section of a chapter of this book, and it's the first chapter of Mr. Halpern's book on Arlene Specter and on the doctors. He goes into Dr. Colonel Fink, who did not do any more than 2 autopsies in his life, and he was called in. He had been involved in autopsies that were accidents or disease, but when they questioned Dr. Fink, he had not done autopsies of bullet wounds, and he was certainly remiss, and he had reviewed paper cases, but he mentioned specifically only 2 bullet wound cases in which he had personally testified, and that is the Dr. Fink that was called in to do the autopsy on John Kennedy, and the x-rays, of course, were never developed to see if there were more bullets in the body. Well, it's important to go over this testimony, and this isn't testimony. I keep calling it testimony. This is a written chapter of an autopsy it's called The Body Seems to Defy Physical Laws, and it's by Dr. Halpern. And it's important to mention, as I say, that Dr. Halpern died this week, that he got sick in San Diego while he was talking at a convention, and he would have been a very valuable witness before the new investigation in the House of Representatives, and he died just at this time when Dr. Shaw is coming forward. I'm out of time now, but maybe next week on Dialogue Conspiracy I'll continue a little bit in the beginning with the testimony of Dr. Shaw and Dr. Gregory, who did the surgery on the wrist and the chest of John Connally, to show you that in 1964 these gentlemen were testifying that the bullet could not have done all the damage. And this is not new evidence. The important thing is, as the evidence comes before the Warren Commission's new investigation of the House of Representatives, a very important person died, and call it one more coincidence, if you will, but it's a tragic loss, and I feel badly about that. Well, I think we'll sign off this week, and we'll read some of that testimony next week for you, and then get on with a few more unhappy incidences.
There is a truth, I thought to myself, while driving down Route 68. The car in front is a Renault. It's not behind, it's not a Ford. There is a truth in how things happen. If it was yesterday, it wasn't 1894. And if tomorrow's gonna too come true, there'll be another truth in store. And those who think there is no truth, that all depends on point of view, will lock us up and fire the bombs made only for a gentleman to use. The president is just a choice. He should not incite or claim his fame. One November night I heard the screaming horns. A new America had changed her name. We're not the same, you and I are not. You who called free thinkers enemies, you are clearly now the enemies. And we will do what we must do to keep it free, like I must write and she must sing and they must slave. You must have heard that we will never really rise again. The minds behind the plastic bugles gave the word that they cannot just mow us down. It's they who are the arch anemic ones. Ours are free and tender girls. Ours are mountain climbing sons. So you and I who disagree, that truth exists but misery. I cry for you, I cry for us, as I prepare to leave the bus. Mm. There is a truth for you and me to feast our eyes upon and see. The sun is true, but for the blind, and we are free, but for our minds. There is a truth